So with the NBA season on the horizon once again, I figured that it was about time that I do my season previews for the teams that I'm particularly interested in, kind of similar to how I did in the last offseason. Now, there's a lot of teams that I'm pretty interested in this year because I think that parity is an all-time level. I know just about everyone can agree with that. We've had 5 different champions in the past 5 years, which hasn't happened since the 70s. And I think that the parity this year can be even better than last year if we get a healthy playoffs in the East. Because, I mean, last year the West was an absolute bloodbath on the way to the finals, whereas the East, we had a lot of teams get injured and the Celtics didn't really get tested in the East. So because of this, I plan on talking about a lot of different teams, before the first game. So I would suggest subscribing to stay tuned for that because this is most likely going to be my first upload for all the season previews. And I figured what would be a better way to kick off these season previews than selecting a team that always knows how to keep things interesting, that being the Philadelphia 76ers. Let's go ahead and start the Sixers off by talking about how they did last season from start to finish. Now, they did start off very well. They were a top 3 seed for like the whole season until January or February when Embiid got hurt. And then they ended up falling to the 7th seed and they lost the Knicks in 6 games in the first round. Now, when Embiid was healthy, they looked very good. Maxey had improved and Embiid was the runaway MVP candidate. But I don't think a lot of people were taking their team seriously because, we've kind of seen this play out with the Sixers before where they're strong in the regular season. And then they end up collapsing in the playoffs. Now, I did actually make a video on the Sixers early in January last season where I talked about kind of how I expect for them to look going into the playoffs. And I had the hot take that I don't think that this is the same Sixers team as the years past where they're going to just end up, totally defeating themselves in the playoffs and, probably in hilarious fashion. And that ended up not being the case, as I did make some points in that video where I said now that they have like a real NBA coach, they're going to have someone to actually kind of like lead them and guide them in those tough playoff situations. And I also said that I didn't expect for Embiid to kind of disappear in the playoffs because their offense became a lot less ISO heavy, and I thought that was going to help because we have seen Embiid's ISO fall off in the playoffs from time to time. And I would say that those predictions ended up holding true in the playoffs last season. I would say with Nick Nurse, I thought he did a fine job. And I'll also say that, like I said in January, I didn't think Embiid was going to end up kind of disappearing late in games and late in series like he did in years past. And this was even despite him clearly still struggling with his knee at that time. He had a very good series, and I thought that Nick Nurse was a big factor into that. Now, another prediction that ended up coming true that I said in that video was that I expected for their bench, or at least the end of their bench, to end up probably failing them in the playoffs. I kind of said towards the end of the video, I didn't go into it very much, but I was expecting for the Sixers that if they were to lose in the playoffs, I was probably going to walk away saying, well, either they just got flat out outplayed or the end of their bench ended up being a bit too weak to go the distance. And that ended up being true. And I also said in previous years, with the Stars kind of failing in spectacular fashion, I thought that it became overlooked, that their bench was never really that good. The last time they really had a good bench would be when Jimmy was there, in my opinion. So I thought the bench in previous years had kind of skirted a bunch of blame. And I predicted this season that with the Stars kind of getting their shit together, most likely, we're going to end up seeing the bench kind of fail them. And I would say that would be true, considering that we had things like, 37-year-old Kyle Lowry was starting. We had Batum guarding Brunson for a lot of minutes. We had, Tobias Harris. If you want to call him a star, maybe this doesn't count, but really a role player in Tobias Harris was averaging 9 points a game and being paid like a top 20 player. So you just can't win playoff series, especially against a team that was as good as the Knicks, with those factors going on. And really what we saw in that Knicks series was that the Knicks were way too deep for the Sixers. And the Sixers had, some critical flaws that were exposed by the Knicks in that series. So, for example, you had no one to guard Brunson whatsoever. They didn't have a very good perimeter defense last year, and they were very unfortunate to have to face Brunson in the first round. But he ended up exposing them. And even though Brunson didn't have a very efficient series, looking back at it, he was just carving up the defense so much that it created so many open looks for him. There was just no way that they were going to win that series, when you have Batum guarding Brunson for that many minutes. And then also you have Tobias Harris just laying a goose egg in the last game and averaging, 9-something points a game. You can't win games when you're paying someone almost $40 million and they're only putting up 9 points a game. And really, I will say with Tobias Harris's chapter kind of ending with the Sixers, he's really overlooked, not so much by Sixers fans, but he's really overlooked by the rest of NBA fans as a reason why the Sixers have kind of failed time and time again in the playoffs, because he is not a very good playoff performer. If you watch him, you know this. If you look at his stats, you'll also know this. But kind of people talk about, with Bradley Beal, he's being paid $50 million as a third option and it's not really working out. His production isn't high enough to really warrant that contract anymore. And with Tobias Harris, it's even more so because he's getting paid like a top 20 player, but he's only playing like a top 50 player in the regular season and probably even worse in the playoffs. So really, a lot of these Sixers teams in the past few years, ever since they signed him in 2019, they were kind of doomed from the start with Tobias Harris going in and eating up that much money. And like I said earlier, they really didn't have a very good bench since Jimmy Butler was there in 2018 and 2019. And after they ended up signing Tobias Harris to that long-term contract, we saw that their bench was not up to par with the other East contenders. So going forward into this offseason, there were a lot of obvious things that they needed to do. I think even the Sixers front office knew this. Obviously, Tobias Harris had to go. You don't even sign him for a minimum. I mean, he was just done there. There's no way that the fans were going to let him come back. And then after that, they obviously needed a major team reconstruction. Not saying they needed to blow it up and get rid of their stars, but we kind of saw in that Knicks series, they had a lot of holes in their team and they needed to really reshuffle up their role players. I'm not going to be doing a specific, off-season section. That's not really the spirit of the video, but I will be talking about their off-season here and there as I talk about the new players that they added this off-season. But going ahead and starting with the big fella himself, Embiid, not going to say a lot about him because we all kind of know who he is on this team. I think he's the longest serving member on this team right now, and he is their star. Now, I know that, public opinion on him can be pretty polarized, but as I said before on this channel, I do think that it's undeniable that when he's on his game, he is a player that can win you a championship. Now, of course, he's had a lot of playoff woes in the past, but like I said, last season, I thought that Nick Nurse was going to be putting an end to that because he was going to have a real NBA coach for the first time in his career. And we saw that in last year's playoffs. Now, obviously, that's only 6 games. But we did see that he was getting guarded by Hardenstein and Mitchell Robinson, and he was even playing on a bum knee to an extent, and he did very well. So personally, I'm optimistic for him in the playoffs this season. What I'm really worried about is if he's going to be healthy, of course, because, really with Embiid, every time I watch him and he hits the deck, I just kind of have to hold my breath because he's just that type of player. I really do think that he could stand to lose like 10 pounds or something, especially since he doesn't play as physical as he used to. I think if you were to go back and look at his breakout season, in 2020 and 2021, I think he played a lot more physical back then, and just in my opinion. So if he's not going to be a big bruiser anymore, he does not need the extra weight, and it will help with his conditioning as well. Next up is Maxey, who I'm not going to say a lot about because he's pretty straightforward as a player, and I think a lot of people are on the same page on him. Now, obviously, he is an all-star level player now. He's come a long way. And he did have a very, very good playoff series against the Knicks last year, a very stout defense in the Knicks as well. He did have a very big leap last year, although I did say last year I thought this was more so kind of Nick Nurse retooling their offense, and it definitely helped Maxey a lot. I didn't think it was so much individual skill improvement as more so just playing under a better offense. But I do think he is kind of one of their X factors this year, because if he does make the jump to, let's say, all NBA level, it's going to be a massive difference for them. I don't think that's personally happening, but at his age, it's certainly possible. And now on to the big free agent signing of this year, Paul George. There's a lot of ways this could go this season, honestly. I kind of have my idea on how this could go, but I do admit there's a lot of ways this could go. He could very well be Tobias Harris 2.0, or he could be the perfect third option for them on a championship team. Now, as for how he did last year, he was an all-star, but I will say that his game, or rather how he moves, he's slowed down a lot in the recent years. And right now he's 34, and he's going to be 35 in May, which is pretty scary. Even worse is they signed him to a 4-year contract, so they're going to be paying like 38-year-old Paul George like a max contract, which is a nightmare in my opinion. But I do have faith in Daryl Morey down the line. And when it comes to getting rid of undesirable contracts, like they were able to get rid of Ben Simmons, they were able to get rid of Al Horford. So I really think that, they're looking at win now. And I guess this is fine for win now, I suppose. When it comes to last year in the playoffs, I will say I'll give him a bit of a pass because, while he wasn't all that efficient, Kawhi did get hurt. So, he was expected to play a role above what he's not really supposed to be. So it didn't look very pretty overall. Now, I do know that he's had some playoff woes over the years. Now, obviously, he's kind of had a lot of different playoff statuses where, he came on the scene as like, a big playoff performer. And then we had, playoff P come. And he's kind of recovered it a bit in the years. I have good faith in him as like a third option because, there's not as much expectation and defensive pressure on him, but he is still a little bit suspicious. Not as suspicious as Tobias Harris, but I'm a little suspicious of him in the playoffs. And really just to go back to the contract, like I said with Tobias Harris, a top 20 contract for like a top 50 player is just not how you're going to be able to flesh out a deep bench that's going to win you a championship. This is looking kind of similar where you're getting like a top 10 contract and you're getting like a top, 20 player right now, and we're getting a top 20 player that's going to be falling off pretty soon. It could be a situation where like, if Jason Tatum is the Michael Jordan of Tobias Harris's, I think Paul George is the Kobe Bryant of Tobias Harris's. And because of that, because you're paying, $50 million to your third option, who's really only about all-star level, probably not going to be an all-star this year. I think that this big offseason splash that they made is going to depend a lot on how they fleshed out the rest of their bench and if this risky move is going to be worth it. Now, I do think personally for Paul George, I think him being the certified third option is going to be good for him. Just lowering his usage rate is going to be good for him at this age, and he's going to be an upgrade from Tobias Harris in the regular season and the playoffs. One thing for him that I'm really worried about more so is his health, especially considering that you have Embiid on this team as well. Now, this team isn't, winning a championship without Embiid, but also losing Paul George in the regular season at the same time Embiid would be a little bit scary for this team, and it could be play-in territory for them. And we did see, with Paul George, for example, he got injured in the 2021 playoffs. He got injured in the 2023 playoffs. We're seeing with Embiid as well. Of course, he got a little bit injured in the 2024 playoffs. He got injured in the 2022 playoffs. He got a little bit injured in the 2021 playoffs. So there's a lot of injury potential for this team and its stars. And with Paul George, he hasn't played a lot of games in the recent years. Now, he did play 74 games last year, but for example, before that, he played 56, he played 31, he played 54, he played 48. But like I said earlier, $50 million for a third option is going to mean that third option either needs to ball out, or you're going to need a very strong supporting cast as a contingency for that, despite having not a lot of money for that. So just kind of quickly going through their supporting cast, you have people like Kelly Oubre, who's on a pretty team-friendly contract. He's a very reliable all-around player. I thought he did very well last year considering his role. I do think they upgraded at their backup center considerably, as we did see with Paul Reed last year. He really just did not show up in the playoffs. And he's done okay as a backup center, but I do think that Drummond is possibly going to be the best backup in the league, and we did see that Drummond did very well in the past when he was on the Sixers. And this is also going to be important considering that Embiid is probably not playing 82 games this year. You also have Eric Gordon and Reggie Jackson being signed, and so that kind of improves their guard depth. Now, I will say with Reggie Jackson, I think he's probably over the hill, but maybe he'll have a career revival here. I'm not counting on it. But Eric Gordon is someone I think that they can probably count on. He's getting a little bit up there in age, but I still think he did pretty well in the Suns last year. You also have like Kmart Jr., for example, who's a pretty young player. There's a lot of potential there. I'm not really sure on how that's going to actualize this season, but he has upside at least. And then you also have Kyle Lowry, I did say earlier, Kyle Lowry starting at this age is not very optimal. But having him as a backup point guard would probably be fine as long as he doesn't ball off very hard this year, which is on the table. But at the same time, he also does have a lot of experience, and he does have some leadership qualities, in my opinion. So I think that's fine. As for McCain, I don't really have anything to say about him because I don't really follow college basketball about that, but I do see a lot of people saying good things about him. And then finally with Yabusele, I guess, that's kind of like you just go for it kind of off-season move for them. I did watch him in the Olympics, and I thought he looked very good. But the Olympics is the Olympics. If that translated to the NBA, Dennis Schroeder would be a max player, and Patty Mills and things like that. But he certainly does have good energy to him. I think that, the Sixers could use a good energy guy, kind of like when they have Patrick Beverley, for example. So, yeah, he was one of the best players in Spain last year, but, I don't watch Euro League or anything. I really don't know a lot about this player. I did find out that he was, he was like the 16th pick a long time ago. So there was a time when he did have a lot of potential, it seems, and, he did end up having to go to Europe, and some players, it takes them a long time to kind of get back into the league, like PJ Tucker, for example. But it does seem like he does have actual potential, and this wasn't actually some just kind of fluke in the playoffs. So I'm very interested in seeing how this goes. If he can make it into the playoff rotation, that would be a huge signing for them, and just kind of making that kind of call. And then, of course, they were also able to get Caleb Martin for only $8 million a year, which I think is a pretty good deal, considering that he's been reliable in the Heat. I don't think he's just like some type of Heat system player. He's been reliable in the Heat for a while, and of course, he did have that crazy Celtics series in 2023. But I certainly think that's someone they're going to be able to rely on in the playoffs as well. Now, that's all the individual players I really wanted to talk about, so I'll go ahead and wrap this video up by talking about what I think about the team as a whole and what I expect for them in the playoffs. Now, when it comes to a real championship contender, I expect for them to have an 8 or 9 man rotation in the playoffs, and every man in that rotation is able to pull their own weight. Now, looking at the Sixers here, I'll go ahead and list off the people that I for the most part, expect to pull their own weight in the playoffs. I think that would be Embiid, Paul George, Tyrese Maxey, Caleb Martin, Kelly Oubre, Andre Drummond, Eric Gordon, Kyle Lowry, and maybe Reggie Jackson, maybe Yabusele. So I'm kind of counting like 7-ish. And there's some other people that have upside like Jared McCain and Kenyon Martin. So they definitely have a lot of potential for kind of like the 8th man or 9th man in their playoff rotation. Now that's really just the most basic kind of requirement for a true championship team. But of course, there are other factors that go into this, and a lot of them don't play into the Sixers' favor. For example, a true playoff contender has to be healthy. And when you have Joel Embiid and Paul George on your team, there's a lot of question marks going into whether these two can be healthy at the same time for large periods of the season, and more importantly, the playoffs. Now, aside from the injuries, there are also, concerns about playoff woes. Now, I did say that for the most part, I do trust Embiid and Paul George in the playoffs going forward, but I do not 100% trust them. But as for the rest of their supporting cast, I'm very impressed with what they did this year, especially with such little money. They got possibly the best backup center in the league and someone that's fit in the Sixers system before very well. And I think that their perimeter D got a lot better, as we did see last year in the Knicks. Their perimeter D got carved up, and I think they improved just in general. Now, I don't think they have a lockdown defender like a lot of championship teams have, but it certainly got better from last year. We see these teams like people have like Bruce Brown or Drew Holiday or Gary Payton Jr., etc. I don't think they have a lockdown defender, which makes me a little bit worried in the playoffs, but I don't think they're going to have a total perimeter defensive meltdown like they did last year. So to go ahead and sum up my thoughts on the Sixers, I kind of agree with a lot of people that have been saying online this year. I see a lot of people just saying the Sixers have like a squad. It seems like a popular thing to say about them. I think that's true. I think that their depth is the best it's been in about 5 years. I think their stars are more reliable than it has been in the past. Like, they don't have James Harden. They don't have Ben Simmons now. They have an Embiid and Maxey duo, and this is an Embiid that has a real playoff coach. And the rest of this team has a real playoff coach as well. And I will also say I'm not going to be one of those people that just says, the Sixers are, they're the Sixers, they're not getting out of the second round. Just stop, don't take them seriously. They don't have a squad. I'm not going to be one of those people, like I said last year. I think that the Sixers have changed. In the past, I was one of those people that said, they're just too deeply flawed and they're just destined to blow up in the playoffs. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that last year they showed us that they were a squad. They were a flawed squad last year, and they got exposed by the Knicks. I think their team got a lot better this offseason, even though there's a lot of question marks about them. primarily around Embiid's health and Paul George's health. But I think top to bottom, this is the best Sixers team in a while. Now, I'm not going to be putting them as like a tier 1 contender. You know, I am going to be doing a tier list of every team in the NBA before the season starts when it comes to, you know, what I think their playoff aspirations are. Now, with the Sixers, I'm not going to be putting them in tier 1 because there's just way too many questions about their health, for one. Another thing is that this is a brand new team, so we're going to see how this meshes together this year. You know, things could not go well for them. So I can't put them as a tier 1 contender because they're very untested just on paper alone. And they also, of course, have, you know, the injury woes with, you know, Paul George and Embiid. But we'll see what happens with them this year. I think that if they're healthy and they're on their game, I think that's going to make the East playoffs very interesting because we're going to finally have a Sixers team to take seriously and kind of cause some chaos in the East playoffs. Maybe even get out of the second round if they're feeling frisky. But with all that being said, let me know what y'all think about the Sixers and what y'all think about this video specifically as well in the comments, and I'll get back to y'all. I also plan on doing several more videos about other contenders and other teams that I think are interesting, you know, and what I think about their outlook going forward. And like I also said, I'm going to be doing a tier list of every NBA team and their outlook going into the next season, right before the season starts. So I was just subscribing so you can catch up with, you know, these other season previews that are coming up. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Comment something you have something to say, and thank y'all for watching, and I guess I'll see y'all next time.